A simple woman helped a stranger in the rain. Then she heard a knock that changed her life. The rain fell like a curtain, heavy and constant, draping the quiet street of Texas in a blanket of cold and gray. It was the kind of evening that sent people hurrying home, hunched under umbrellas, eager for warmth. But for Margaret, the owner of a tiny flower shop tucked between a laundromat and a bakery, this kind of weather was familiar, almost comforting in its solitude. She moved with practiced care, her fingers slightly stiff from the damp air as she arranged the last bouquet of the day. White lilies, soft yellow roses, and a hint of eucalyptus, simple, elegant, like everything about her. Her shop was old-fashioned, smelling faintly of soil and lavender, just the way she liked it. Outside, the rain showed no sign of letting up. She reached for the shutters, ready to close for the night, when something caught her eye. Across the street, near a battered bus stop, stood a man. Soaked to the skin, no coat, no umbrella, his arms wrapped around himself in a futile attempt at warmth. His head was bowed, dark hair plastered to his forehead. He didn't look drunk or dangerous, just lost, forgotten by the world. Before we move further, please ensure to like, share, and subscribe for heartwarming stories like this. Margaret hesitated. For a brief second, she considered ignoring him. She was tired, her back ached, and she still had to walk home through the rain herself. But something about the man, his stillness, maybe, or the way he looked as though he hadn't been spoken to in days, stirred something in her. A quiet resolve. She reached behind the counter and picked up her spare umbrella, the one she always kept in case hers broke. Then she grabbed the thermos of tea she hadn't touched all day, still faintly warm, and stepped out into the rain. The chill bit at her cheeks as she approached him, her boots splashing through shallow puddles. He didn't notice her until she was standing in front of him. His eyes lifted, startled, unsure, and for a moment, neither spoke. Margaret simply held out the umbrella. "You'll catch your death out here," she said softly. He blinked, taking her in as though he hadn't heard a kind voice in a very long time. Slowly, hesitantly, he reached out and accepted the umbrella. She handed him the thermos next. "Tea," she added, almost apologetically. "It's not much, but it's warm." The man stared at the items in his hands, then back at her. His lips parted, maybe to speak, maybe to thank her, but he said nothing. Instead, he gave a small nod. Not the kind you give out of politeness, but one that carried weight. As if to say, "I see you, and I won't forget this." Margaret offered a faint smile, the kind that didn't expect anything in return. Then she turned and walked back across the street, her coat growing heavier with every drop of rain. Inside the shop, she didn't look back. She simply resumed her quiet routine, locking the door, flipping the sign to closed. The encounter stayed with her, lingering like the scent of flowers in the air, present, but unspoken. She didn't know his name. She didn't ask. It didn't feel necessary. To her, kindness had never needed an audience or reason. And yet, even as she settled in for the evening, that single moment, unplanned, unnoticed by the world, had already begun weaving itself into the fabric of something far bigger than she could imagine. But for now, it was just a rainy night, a tired woman, and a stranger who looked like he'd forgotten what kindness felt like, until she reminded him. The morning crept in slowly, gray and damp from the night's unrelenting rain. Margaret stirred beneath a knitted blanket, the kind that bore the scent of lavender and age. She blinked against the soft light peeking through the curtains and sat up, greeted only by the silence of her modest home and the soft padding of feline feet across hardwood floors. "Morning, Jasper," she murmured, her voice hoarse with sleep. The tabby leapt onto the windowsill, tail flicking as if in reply. Margaret's home was the kind of place time didn't rush through. The walls wore muted pastels. Corners held memories like breath. A row of worn books lined the living room shelf, their spines leaning against each other like old friends. The fireplace hadn't seen flame in years, but the mantel was cluttered with frames, each a fragment of a life that once was. A man in uniform smiling under sunlit trees, a young Margaret, cheeks full of joy, a honeymoon frozen in sepia tones. She poured herself a cup of tea, the kettle whistling faintly as if afraid to disturb the quiet. No television, no radio. Just the soft hum of a world she'd grown used to, one that rarely reached for her anymore. Margaret's days followed a gentle rhythm, a short walk to the shop, trimming roses, tending petunias, arranging color into meaning. Customers came and went, polite but distant. They bought blooms for birthdays, funerals, apologies, never asking her name. But Margaret never minded. Kindness, to her, wasn't a performance. It was instinct. Back home, she spoke more to Jasper than anyone else. He listened without judgment, his amber eyes always watching, tail curling around her wrist when she paused to pet him. She told him everything from the weather to her dreams, to the stranger she'd helped the night before. That poor man, she whispered while peeling an apple. He looked like he hadn't been seen in years. Jasper blinked slowly, as if confirming her thoughts. The afternoon passed in quiet tasks. Dusting shelves, folding laundry, organizing an old photo album whose pages had begun to yellow at the edges. Each turn of the page carried weight. Her husband's smile smiled up at her from a dozen different decades. He had been gentle, the kind who made tea before she asked and carved her initials into tree trunks just because. Cancer had taken him quickly, mercilessly. There had been no children, no family left to call. Just Margaret, a flower shop, and a life that had narrowed to a quiet echo of what once was. She never spoke of her grief. It settled in her bones, unspoken but ever present. It softened her, made her notice the forgotten things. A broken-winged bird, a child's glove left in the park, a stranger cold in the rain. As the sky darkened again, thunder growled low in the distance. Rain returned like an old friend, tapping insistently at the windows. Margaret settled into her armchair with her tea, a knitted shawl across her shoulders. Jasper curled at her feet, already asleep. The house, old but sturdy, creaked softly as the storm swelled outside. The air held that electric tension, like the moment just before lightning touches down. Margaret exhaled deeply, closing her eyes, letting her thoughts drift to nothing in particular. She didn't hear the knock at first. It came again, slow, deliberate, heavy against the door. Not frantic, not friendly. Jasper's ears perked. Margaret opened her eyes, heart skipping as silence fell again. Another knock. 3 sharp raps, as if the storm itself had sent something to her doorstep. She sat still, hands tightening around the cup. Her thoughts raced, irrational and tangled. No one ever visited. Not this late. Not in weather like this. A part of her, the part that had grown used to loneliness, wondered if she'd imagined it. But then it came once more. A knock, thick with intent. The kind that demanded acknowledgement. She rose slowly, the warmth of the shawl suddenly insufficient. Her feet touched the cold floor as she stepped cautiously toward the hallway. The ticking of the wall clock filled the space between each step. She paused near the door, breath held, listening. Silence. Rain. The creak of wood shifting under weight. The door remained shut, but whatever was on the other side had not left. And Margaret, still as the night, stood frozen in her own home, not yet ready to open it, but unable to walk away. Something had changed. Something had arrived. And it was waiting. The knock still echoed in Margaret's mind as she unlatched the door, cautious fingers turning the knob with a quiet resistance. The storm had passed, but the night remained heavy with something unspoken. As the door creaked open, a man stood before her, not the hunched, rain-drenched figure from the night before, but someone strikingly composed. His dark suit, crisp and unwrinkled, stood in stark contrast to the damp world behind him. He held an envelope with both hands, as though guarding something sacred. "Margaret?" he asked, his voice calm, certain. She hesitated. "Yes. I'm Adam. My brother. I believe you met him. Yesterday. In the rain." Her heart tightened. For a moment, she thought of denying it. There had been no formal meeting, no names exchanged. But his gaze held no doubt, only a strange gratitude mixed with grief. "He told me about you," Adam continued. It was the last thing he said before he passed. Margaret's breath caught. Passed. The word hung in the air like a fog, not quite real, not fully understood. The man she had offered a thermos and umbrella to had already seemed so far from the world. Was it possible he was now gone from it entirely? "I'm sorry," she said quietly, though the words felt too small. Adam gave a faint nod, the kind of nod people give when they've already cried what they can. His eyes held something deeper than sorrow. He hadn't spoken about anyone with warmth in years. But he remembered you. That simple moment, it meant something to him. Margaret didn't know what to say. She had given a stranger a gesture, nothing more. No questions, no names. Certainly not enough, in her mind, to be remembered. But maybe, to someone who had spent so long unseen, it had been everything. Adam extended the envelope. "He wanted you to have this," he said. "Said it would make sense to you one day. That it was the least he could do for the only kindness he'd known in a long time." Margaret took the envelope with careful hands, her fingers brushing his for the briefest second. It felt heavier than it should have. She didn't open it right away. Her eyes searched his face, still half expecting some twist, some misunderstanding. "Your brother?" she asked finally. "What was his name?" "Daniel." She let the name settle in her chest. Daniel. It suited the quiet man in the rain, dignified, gentle, maybe lost. We hadn't spoken in over a decade, Adam said, almost as if to explain the distance that couldn't be seen. He struggled. Things fell apart. He wouldn't let anyone help. He looked away, jaw tightening. I never got the chance to make things right. But you gave him peace. Even if only at the end. Margaret felt a tremor rise in her throat, not of fear, but of something heavier. This wasn't what she expected when she answered the door. A thank you, perhaps. A nod to kindness returned. But not this, a bridge between two lives that had never been meant to intersect. The envelope remained unopened in her hands, its edges slightly worn, as if Daniel had held it for a long time before letting it go. She felt the ridges of what lay inside. A piece of paper, maybe two. And something cold. A key, perhaps. May I ask, she said carefully, where he passed? A small shelter downtown. He was calm. Said he was tired, but ready. Mentioned the tea. The way you didn't ask him for anything. That stuck with him. Adam's voice grew quieter. He wrote the letter the same night. Margaret didn't trust herself to speak. The wind picked up outside, rattling a chime somewhere behind her. She looked down at the envelope again, the weight of it growing heavier with every breath. It was not just paper and metal. It was memory, regret, redemption, and something unnamed. It was a gift forged in the briefest flicker of human decency. Adam stepped back, as if sensing her need to be alone. He wanted you to know, he said, that you changed something. Margaret nodded, lips pressed tight. She couldn't speak. Not yet. Take care of yourself, Margaret, Adam added gently. Whatever's in there, it's yours now. With that, he turned and walked into the night, his steps echoing down the empty street. Margaret stood still, fingers closed around the envelope like it was breakable. She didn't move, not even when the wind pushed against the door behind her. The world was quiet again, but inside her, something had been set in motion. She closed the door slowly, holding the envelope against her chest as if it might disappear. The room felt different now, less empty somehow. Still silent, but with meaning tucked inside the hush. She stared at the envelope, knowing full well it could wait. And yet, it seemed to pulse with possibility, with truth waiting to be read. But not just yet. The envelope sat untouched on the kitchen table, its edges now faintly curled, as though time itself had started to fold around it. Margaret stared at it for what felt like hours. The house was silent, save for the occasional creak of old wood and the subtle purring of Jasper, curled nearby like a guardian of the unknown. When her hands finally reached for it, they moved with reverence, not urgency. She opened it slowly, as if expecting the weight of its contents to spill out in more than just paper and ink. Inside was a folded letter, and tucked within it, delicate, almost hidden, a yellowed property deed. But it was the handwriting on the page that drew her in first, slanted, rushed in places, but unmistakably human. She unfolded the letter and began to read aloud, her voice soft but shaky. Dear Margaret, I never learned your name. Maybe that's what makes this easier. You won't look at me as someone who failed, but as someone you simply helped. I was the man at the bus stop. You brought warmth into a day when I'd forgotten the world could be kind. Margaret paused. Her breath caught. The words weren't dramatic or flowery, yet each one struck a chord deep in her chest. I wasn't always like that. There was a time when people knew me by my paintings. My name is Daniel. I used to fill galleries with color, with stories. But life has a way of unraveling you. One wrong turn, then another, until the mirror shows someone you don't recognize. Addiction didn't arrive with fireworks. It came quietly, like rot beneath the surface. And by the time I realized what I'd become, the world had already closed its doors. Margaret felt the words like wounds reopening. She could picture him now, not just as the soaked stranger under the rain, but as a man who once stood proudly in front of his work, who had something to offer the world. I lost my family. I pushed them away. I couldn't paint, couldn't feel. But then, there was you. You didn't ask my name. You didn't question if I deserved kindness. You just gave it. The tea warmed more than my hands. The umbrella felt like a shield I hadn't known I needed. That moment stayed with me. It reminded me that I was still alive, that I hadn't completely disappeared. Margaret swallowed, her throat dry. Her fingers gripped the edges of the letter as though holding on to him, this man she'd barely known and yet now felt impossibly close to. I didn't know how to repay you, but I remembered something. My father left me a cottage years ago, out in the countryside. I never went. Thought I didn't deserve a place like that. Maybe I still don't. But maybe you do. Her eyes shifted to the deed beside the letter, her mind beginning to grasp what he was saying, yet still disbelieving. "I'm leaving it to you, Margaret. The place is yours now. I can't offer much, but perhaps that house can offer you something I never found, peace. You reminded me what grace looks like, what it feels like. I hope, wherever you are when you read this, you feel something close to what you gave me that day. Thank you, Daniel." The letter slipped from her hands and floated gently to the floor. Margaret stood frozen, chest rising and falling with the weight of what she had just heard. Emotion surged: grief for a man she'd never truly known, awe at the magnitude of his gift, and a confusion that rooted her to the spot. The cottage. The deed. A stranger's final gesture, born from a moment she had almost forgotten. She picked up the letter again, this time folding it with care. Her hands trembled, not from age, but from the quiet quake of transformation. Outside, the wind whispered against the windows as if echoing her swirling thoughts. The house, usually so familiar in its silence, now felt strange, as though the very air had shifted, recognizing that something profound had occurred. That night, Margaret didn't sleep. She sat at the table long after the tea had gone cold, the letter beside her, the key lying untouched. She read his words again and again. The name Daniel no longer belonged to a stranger. It lived now inside her thoughts, etched into the corners of her heart like the signature on an old painting. Whatever came next, she knew this much: something had changed. Something had awakened. And the life she thought she knew had quietly turned a corner. But for now, she sat in the stillness, listening to the echoes of a man's last words, and to the quiet stir of possibility, rising like dawn beyond the windows. The decision came quietly, as many of Margaret's decisions did, not with a dramatic proclamation, but with a single motion, the turning of her flower shop sign from open to closed, indefinitely. She stood at the window a moment longer, watching petals sway gently in their glass faces, as if sensing their caretaker's farewell. The shop had been her sanctuary for years, a place where grief could be muted beneath the scent of fresh lilies. But now, something deeper pulled her elsewhere, a pull that began with a letter and ended with a key. She left no notes, only silence. Her footsteps echoed through familiar streets until she reached the quiet station just past the old church. A one-way ticket. The name of the village, barely legible on the train schedule, meant nothing to her. And yet, it felt like the beginning of something she couldn't yet define. The train pulled away from the city without fanfare, weaving its way through gray hills and meadows fading into mist. Margaret sat by the window, watching the world blur past: old barns, sleeping cattle, fog-drenched woods. Everything felt suspended, weightless, as though time had chosen to pause and let her breathe. Hours passed before the train slowed. The countryside was cloaked in fog so thick it seemed to move like breath across the land. Margaret stepped onto the platform alone. No taxis, no crowds, just a cracked sign bearing the village's name and the faint cry of crows in the distance. The cottage, according to the letter, was just beyond the woods. Her feet crunched across gravel, then damp leaves, as the path wound upward. The air smelled of wet earth and pine. She moved slowly, half expecting the house to vanish the moment it came into view. But it didn't. It stood waiting. A slanted roof, ivy crawling up its stone walls, windows clouded with age. The paint was peeling, and the gate groaned as she pushed it open. Still, there was something noble in the way the house stood, abandoned but not forgotten. It had weathered time. Like her. She unlocked the door with a click that echoed too loudly. Inside, the scent of dust and old wood filled the air. Light filtered in through the curtains, casting soft shadows on the floor. There were cobwebs in the corners, furniture covered in white sheets like sleeping ghosts. But there was also warmth, a presence. As if Daniel's spirit lingered in the walls, waiting to be seen. The rooms were small but full of character. A fireplace long unused. A writing desk scarred with ink stains. And, in the farthest room, she found them, trunks, stacked in the corner, each one sealed but humming with something unsaid. She opened the first with tentative fingers. Inside, dozens of paintings wrapped in fabric, edges worn. Waited in silence. As she unwrapped them, one by one, breath caught in her throat. Scenes of anguish. Abstract storms. Broken figures with faceless eyes. But there were others, too: quiet landscapes, fragile portraits, moments of grace captured with startling tenderness. Each canvas whispered of a life lived on a knife's edge, of beauty and suffering twined like vines. Margaret sat on the floor, surrounded by Daniel's art. Tears welled up, not from sorrow, but from the overwhelming truth of it. She had met him for only a moment. Yet here he was, laid bare in brushstrokes and color. His soul preserved in silence. She stayed that night in the cottage. Wrapped in blankets beside the cold hearth, she couldn't sleep, not with her thoughts so loud. The next morning, She rose before the sun and began cleaning. Each sweep of the broom, each crack mended and hinge oiled, was an act of quiet devotion. Cobwebs gave way to light. Dust gave way to scent, lavender, and lemon oil. As days passed, the cottage began to breathe again. And so did she. Margaret moved through the house as if following Daniel's unspoken instructions. She polished the windows until they revealed the misty fields beyond. She aired the linens, repaired the curtains, scrubbed forgotten corners. She hung some of his gentler works in the hallway, ones that held warmth, not despair. But this wasn't just restoration. Something within her was shifting. The silence that once weighed heavy now soothed her. The loneliness she once accepted now felt like solitude, chosen, rather than endured. She began to hum as she worked. And at night, when she stood by the front door, watching the fog roll through the hills, she no longer felt like a visitor. The house, battered and still healing, was starting to feel like hers. Margaret didn't know what she was building toward. She didn't need to. All she knew was that something once lost had led her here. Not just to a forgotten cottage, but to a place within herself she had long since buried. And for the first time in years, she was willing to see what might grow again. The days in the countryside passed not in rushes, but in quiet unravelings. The cottage, once weighed down by years of silence, now carried a different kind of stillness, one that soothed rather than haunted. Margaret found comfort in its rhythm, the creak of the old floorboards, the wind weaving through the trees, the warm scent of wood and lavender that seemed to seep from the walls. She spent her mornings restoring what was broken, her afternoons walking the narrow trails that led past fields of golden grass and into a village that slowly began to feel familiar. At first, the locals regarded her with polite distance. A woman alone in an old painter's cottage stirred quiet curiosity. But as the days wore on, so did the walls people carried. Names were exchanged. Conversations bloomed. Margaret learned where the best honey came from, who sold the freshest bread, and which neighbors kept a kettle always warm. And then, one gray morning, with rain whispering against the window panes, she found herself seated at the old wooden table with a blank sheet of paper before her and a pencil in her hand. She didn't know why she reached for it. It had been decades since she'd tried to draw anything more than a shopping list or a flower label. Yet something inside her stirred, a tremble of possibility, a whisper she hadn't heard in years. She drew the rain first, lines of motion, soft and slanted. Then the man, faceless, but wrapped in a coat of sorrow. The umbrella, the thermos, the knock. Her memories took form in hesitant lines. It wasn't perfect, but it was hers. The act of drawing opened something in her. That evening, she rummaged through the trunks Daniel had left behind, not for his art this time, but for his tools. She found brushes, old but intact, tubes of paint thick with age, and a stack of unused canvases hidden beneath the largest chest. She set one on the easel and stood before it like a woman seeing herself for the first time. Her first painting was clumsy. The second, a little less so. By the third, she had lost track of time entirely. Each stroke was a release. Her grief, her solitude, her questions. They spilled from her fingers into color. She painted the cold of the rain, the warmth of a smile unreturned, the moment a knock at the door changed the shape of her world. The canvas became her journal. And unlike words, paint didn't demand clarity, only truth. Word of her presence in the cottage began to spread. A few villagers, curious and kind, asked if they could see Daniel's art. Margaret obliged. She wiped the dust from his frames and opened the doors wide. Those who entered spoke in whispers, standing in awe of Daniel's raw emotion, his delicate chaos. Moved by their reactions, she got an idea. Tentatively, she asked the village center if they would consider hosting a small exhibition. Just Daniel's work, she said. A tribute. A thank you. They agreed. The evening of the exhibition, the sky turned a soft rose hue. The room, once used for town meetings and quilting clubs, was transformed. Daniel's paintings lined the walls like witnesses to a life rediscovered. Candles flickered in jars. People came, not in droves, but enough to fill the space with warmth. Margaret stood off to the side, her hands clasped, watching as neighbors, some she knew by name now, others still strangers, paused in front of each piece. They asked questions. They listened to his story. And when Margaret spoke of Daniel, her voice did not waver. She told them about the rain, the moment of quiet mercy, and the letter that changed everything. Among the visitors was a local journalist, young and thoughtful, who asked if he might share the story more widely. Margaret hesitated, then nodded. Not for recognition, but for Daniel. For the man who once thought himself forgotten and was now, in a quiet village hall, remembered. After the exhibition, something shifted. People stopped her in the bakery. Children waved at her in the street. She was no longer the woman in the cottage. She was Margaret, kind, unexpected, a reminder that one gentle act could echo across lives. She still painted each morning. Her own works now stood beside Daniel's in the hallway, not for comparison, but in conversation, as if their lives, so briefly entwined, continued speaking to each other through color and canvas. Margaret didn't call herself an artist. She didn't need to. What she had uncovered was not a talent, but a language, a way to speak when words fell short. And in speaking, she had found not only herself, but a place where she no longer felt invisible. The cottage, once forgotten, now held stories. Daniel's, hers, and perhaps, in time, even more. Margaret sat in her usual spot, brush in hand, gaze steady on the canvas before her. She worked slowly, thoughtfully, no longer hesitant, no longer questioning if what she created mattered. Today, she painted not from memory, but from presence. A field just beyond the ridge. The soft roll of hills. The way the mist hugged the trees at dawn. It was quiet work, but honest. Jasper, grown lazier with age, was curled beneath the table, his tail twitching in his sleep. A faint smile played on Margaret's lips. This, she had come to realize, was peace, not the loud, triumphant kind, but the sort that settled deep into your bones, unnoticed until one day you wake up and realize you no longer ache. Then came the knock. It was soft, almost uncertain, a single sound that sliced through the quiet like a whisper in a dream. Margaret froze, not in fear, but in recognition. She placed the brush gently into the jar and stood, wiping her hands on her apron. The walk to the door was slow, measured. Not unlike the one she'd taken all those months ago, when another knock had turned her world on its axis. She opened it. A young woman stood there. No umbrella, no suitcase, just a messenger bag slung over her shoulder and a weariness behind her eyes that spoke of long roads and silent waiting rooms. She looked travel-worn, damp around the edges, her curls frizzed from the mist. "I'm sorry," the woman said, voice soft. "I missed the last bus. I was told there might be a phone in the village, but everything's closed and I didn't know where else to go." Margaret said nothing for a moment. Her gaze softened. In that young woman, she saw so much exhaustion, yes, but also the flicker of hope that came with the courage to knock. And she remembered. The rain, the stranger, the envelope, the key, the man who had spoken no words but had left her a letter that rewrote her life. And now, another visitor, another door, another choice. Margaret gave a gentle nod. No questions, no hesitation. She stepped aside and opened the door wider, her voice calm, warm. "Come in," she said. "Let's get you warm." The young woman blinked, almost surprised by the welcome. She stepped over the threshold, grateful, still catching her breath. Margaret guided her toward the fire, motioning for her to sit. She fetched a blanket, a cup of tea, the same way she had once offered an umbrella and thermos to a man she'd never seen again, except in paint and memory. She didn't ask the woman's name. It didn't matter. Not yet. There was something unspoken between them, the delicate, invisible thread that only exists in moments of grace, moments where no explanation is needed, only presence. Margaret glanced at her canvas once more, still unfinished, still waiting. But for now, she sat beside a stranger with tired eyes and offered her warmth. Silence filled the room, not heavy or awkward, but sacred. And in that moment, as the light dimmed and the air filled with the faint crackle of the fire, something stirred deep within Margaret again. Not loss, not grief, but recognition. The circle was turning. A knock had changed her life once. And now, as twilight spilled across the hills outside, another knock had come, not as a test, but as a reminder. A beginning, disguised as an ending. And maybe, just maybe, this is how it begins again, for someone else. Don't forget to hit that like button, hit subscribe, and turn on notifications. Share this video. Thank you.